Hello Year 12, today I'm going to talk you through how we would structure our response for the English Literature 2B exam for Year 13. So I want to give you more of an idea about exactly what we have coming ahead of us and how the skills that we're building up at the moment are going to lead you to that point. So a quick run through of the exam that you will look to be sitting next year. It's a 3-hour exam, so it's an hour for each separate essay. And essentially it comes down to how well you can argue and how well you can articulate that expression and viewpoint. It doesn't matter whether your viewpoint is entirely unique and kind of going against the grain. As long as it's well argued and communicated, that's all the exam board are really after. So what I thought I'd kind of go through with you today is in particular addressing section B with a model answer that I've written down, because that's sort of the way that I best process things. A bit of an understanding about section C, and really importantly going over the assessment objectives down to exactly how I would structure a response for this. So your section A, skills that we've already practiced. You've got your unseen extract, which was always going to look to address key ideas and concepts within the social protest genre of writing. So that's really important. You could get a text on absolutely anything. It can be plays, it could be a book, it could be a play script, it could be poetry. So a really good way to prepare for that is to just kind of generally sketch out important moments in our, well, past and recent history really. So if something came up along the lines of the 1960s, you have a vague understanding in history about what actually was occurring in that time, in order for you to bring in some other contextual information to really make your response to an examiner seem pretty good, because you have that extra context. It's not necessary, but you know, it definitely helps in your overall understanding and kind of knowing what forms of oppression and the status quo of the time. So that's section A, and I'll do a separate video about kind of breaking that down again at a later point. And as we move on to section B, that incorporates one of our key texts. In our centre, we're very flexible about which text you choose to do. We haven't yet studied Tony Harrison's poems, but we feel as a department that his poems are overtly linked to protest, and therefore it's quite an easy one to link to the themes of the genre. However, if a question kind of comes up which just fits so well with Blake, and you feel very confident in writing about that, or The Kite Runner, then obviously take that independence to do what you feel comfortable and to do what you feel is a strong text in your repertoire. So for the purposes of today, I'm going to, because we've been studying Blake, I'm going to take you through a section B response where we have Blake as the sort of foreground of this. But if you were to use Blake in section C, say section B you chose Tony Harrison and you do an hour's worth of writing surrounding him, linking with those political themes. Section C then is about comparing the other two texts that you've not yet used. So for the purposes of my example, I would be suggesting that I hadn't used Harrison and I hadn't used The Kite Runner, so therefore I'm going to bring them broadly together in response to the question. The texts don't have to link, you don't have to make any sort of overriding generalisations and similarities and differences between them, but the most important thing is that you answer the question. So for purposes of section B, in response to a question on Blake, we would advise you to combine around 3 poems into your response, covering across Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. For the purposes of this example, I've used 4, but even if you kind of fleetingly just mention another, it just shows your understanding of the poems and just your broad depth really with the anthology. So as a quick reminder then of the assessment objectives that we're all held to account by, I'm going to now direct you at my page, because this is just the best way that I can process my information. Okay, so, right. 5 assessment objectives. Now the most important assessment objective is this one here, AO5. And the exam board explained that once you have a really good grasp of AO5, it means that you can easily weave in the 4 remaining assessment objectives. So you kind of see AO5 as the real foundations of your understanding, because it comes into discussing the argument. What is the crux of what you're debating? And you're also being aware that there are many ways to interpret the text. Your interpretation is not the only one, so it's always about being really tentative with language. And what I mean by tentative is you're using words like this could suggest, this may have been employed to do X, Y, Z, because you're aware that your reading is not the sole reading. So AO1, and you'll see overlaps with GCSE here, it's about the quality of your argument, about how well you organise your argument. So what I've seen from student work in the past is, so you've got that debate question there, and then a student feeling like, so they've got their argument, and then they say, oh, but on this side we can argue this, yet it can also be seen as this, and then therefore the main argument to begin with in the introduction is kind of lost. So it's really important that you're structuring your response in a way that is definitely going to come down to argue your point of view. So if you are doing sort of a balanced argument, on the side that you're representing that you don't really agree with as much, you may be able to pose it in a way of saying, some interpretations may suggest blah 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 blah. However, we can't ignore the overriding themes of blah blah blah, as I have already suggested. AO2, language and structural techniques, really coming to light that this is an English literature essay. You do know a lot about pathetic fallacy, about repetition, about juxtapositions, but most importantly, I would say it's really rooting things in structure. So thinking about the parallels, the contrast between characters, the patterning. So you want to kind of consider that you are up here as a reader, viewing from above, and you're able to cast an eye on what's happening below to really make a sort of general and perceptive comment about what you're reading. So let's take the ones we've done so far, A1, A2, A5. A3 comes down to contextual issues. So in regards to Blake, then you're thinking about the role and existence of childhood. You're thinking about revolution at the time, both within science and reason, in terms of the French Revolution and the things that were inspiring Blake, and works such as John Locke and Rousseau, and the coming of evolution of man, really, in their works. The importance of religion and actually challenging conventional morality, and the sort of Christian doctrine which was binding so many to it. The role of education, and the time period, particularly for Blake, because we need to consider that Songs of Innocence was obviously written first, and it was Songs of Experience that then came after that. So with Experience, Blake had a lot of, a few years to really surmise and reflect upon what was happening in the country, and therefore maybe felt even more cynical or critical of what he was seeing. AO4 is when you're making connections across the literary texts and genre. So that one is in a real grounding in protest and oppression, and the themes and concepts that we're seeing which arise from the social and political protest genre. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look in isolation at this question, imagining it was the second essay of your paper, so falling under section B. Okay. In his poetry, Blake presents parents as oppressive and controlling of their children. To what extent do you agree with this view? So as with any essay question, the thing you want to do is highlight the key words. What is at the basis of this question? We've obviously got the role of parents being really crucial. The fact that they are oppressive and controlling of their children. To what extent do you agree with this view? So you're kind of going to be considering where you stand on that line. Do you 100% fully agree that parents are oppressive and controlling, or do you entirely disagree with that? And you kind of fit yourself on this line. So you might be here and you'll have a reason for that, or you might be here and have a reason for that. The next step that I then go to, or as I've enlisted here, step 1, is I have a general brainstorm. You need to have a mind map, you need to have some sort of spider diagram to just get your brain going, because from the first instance, these questions can seem very big, kind of thinking about, where do you start? So this is why planning is so important. I really can't stress that enough. I hear a lot of students over time saying, I don't need to plan, it just comes to mind. I can promise you, you can always tell the difference between a planned essay, which is really well articulated and thought through, and those that have literally just gone on the spur of the moment. It's so important to dedicate that planning time, so important. I can't stress that enough. So I've said here, step 1, you want to make and create the first stage of your plan. So, as I said before, you want to be considering 3 main poems that you want to bring in, but I'm going to relate to 4 here. And so some of the things I've first started with is questioning what the role of parents are in the collection of poetry. I've recorded here that they're fearful of experience, maybe aspiring to keep their own children innocent, or kind of this bygone age that they can't ever get back to. This protective notion of parental sort of responsibility, the fact that they're not challenging the status quo and therefore are complicit in this sort of negative and vicious cycle which is controlled by the state and government. The fact that they are misguided by their own experience and therefore would be re-educating their own children in a negative way, and one that is compliant with the status quo, or they may be innately jealous of that childhood state of innocence. So those are a few things, because obviously we know parents are really important here. I then begin considering the poems that I want to bring into that. So you can see my little ticks and crosses about whether I'm agreeing with that statement that yes, parents are oppressive and controlling. So in Little Girl Lost and Found, I've said, well, on the first part, yes, they are, because they're fearful of the world of experience and they want to educate and be protective of their child. But then I guess they aren't once they have been educated with after meeting the lion and realising that their fears are just something that is inhibiting them, and actually they need to embrace a relationship with God. The Chimney Sweeper, we see that parents have entirely turned against the main speaker of the poem, and then also how the child is indoctrinated himself in the way that he speaks to Tom in the poem, and kind of brings in that sort of parental and authoritative tone, and trying to kind of parent the younger children. The Little Boy Lost and Found, and how parents aren't oppressive and controlling, because, well, essentially the earthly father turns his back, and actually the parents in this poem, we could argue is the mother, who has kind of this relationship with God, and how God is the parent that is the one who is steering the little boy in the right direction. But then I really wanted to think about Holy Thursday, because there is an absence of parents within this poem, yet the new parental role is actually fulfilled by religious practices and the state, and actually how that is having an oppressive and controlling way over children's lives, which is actually more harmful than parents. With any English essay, you really have to come down to define what you mean by the key terms. And I'm not just suggesting that you look up the dictionary definitions for every single meaning in concepts linked with social and political protest. I'm really saying that these key terms make sense for your writing in your essay. So for me, I've been thinking about, what does oppression mean in the context of the parents in these poems? And I've said, it's coming down to manipulative stance, this idea that the parents are perhaps socially superior, they are maintaining and they're complicit in the status quo, they're committed to hegemonic forces. So hegemony is referring to the ruling class ideology. It's a Marxist term, due to their own indoctrination and this idea of the false consciousness. Once again, Marxism. So that's how you can kind of bring in your own theory along the way, and how they're ultimately concealed from the reality of the oppression. And I've also posed a few questions as well. So I've said, is it parents that are active in the problem, or are they indoctrinated by higher forms of power? In what ways are they controlling the fact that they accept the status quo, and how they perpetuate this vicious cycle? But amongst all of that, it's so important to be considering, well, what are Blake's own intentions? And I've said here that he wishes to maybe expose those flaws in the status quo, perhaps arguing that it's down to innocence and imagination that are going to rid man of these blinkers, and how Blake himself is opposed to conventional morality, so opposed to traditional forms of religion, and practice in the traditional sense. And I've also recorded some key concepts that I really want to include into my essay, and there's far more that I could be doing in terms of critical theory as well. So, step 2. I always come back to this, and let's try and get this straight. And it was probably the best piece of advice I was ever given, actually, as a student, by my teachers, and it's being able to articulate your own line of argument in a sentence, because then you have formulated a really concise opinion that's going to be easy to come back to and address as you write your question. So my line of argument that I considered from that brainstorm is that if parents are presented as oppressive and controlling, then it is engineered by those who set the status quo. So what I mean by that is that basically, yes, parents in some of these poems are oppressive and controlling, but that's because it's the higher forces of power, such as the state, such as the church, and those sort of foundational institutions, the superstructure, I guess, as Marx critics would argue, they've created that. Yeah, so step 3 then, I want to really incorporate this opinion in a more thorough plan. Obviously, I'm not confined here by time restraints, so I have gone into more detail than you probably would be able to achieve in exam conditions, but I'd really urge you to just try to get into the practice and process of these types of questions, because obviously the more you do it, the more you're going to improve your confidence and your pace with them. So in your introduction, lots of different ways to do this, but I think it's really important to address the key concepts and consider the different roles that parents play in the poems that you've chosen for discussion. Maybe something in there about Blake as well. And for me, I think that there's lots of different ways you can structure your responses. You could go through poem by poem, but I think a more sophisticated response is a thematic one. So thinking broadly about what different roles parents play, and how this is articulated in the poems of choice. So you kind of want to be making connections for and against. So the first point here is that I've got that parents can be controlling and oppressive due to own fears about a world of experience, which we see within the Little Girl Lost. But then is a contradictory point to that. The Little Girl Found obviously addresses the fact that the parents reform their own ideologies by unleashing themselves from the status quo. So I've got a really clear topic sentence. You can see here I haven't started talking about any form of techniques. I'd be bringing those into my discussion of the poems, and I'd still be talking about the form of the poems, the rhyme if that's necessary, but as long as it is helping you to really answer that question. Okay, so the second point then I came up with is that parents can be oppressive and controlling due to their own indoctrination, which continues to perpetuate the cycle of established power. So I thought a really good poem to bring into that would be The Chimney Sweeper, where we see, as I've mentioned before, how the speaker is also compliant in adopting these beliefs as he educates Tom. Really being mindful of those AOs that we need to get in. So far we've addressed AO5, we've got AO1 because it's a clear structure. I'm also being conscious of the need to bring in AO3 and context. So I could definitely be talking about the role of childhood and how during this period that childhood wasn't its own sort of socially constructed stage. Childhood is quite a modern stage which is recognised by society, and maybe bringing in some ideas about how those chimney sweepers were really awfully abused and exploited during this period. Third point, how parents are not oppressive and controlling but can reinstate external oppression due to their choices. So I was thinking about how I could bring in The Little Boy Lost and Found. We saw it's actually the child's desire to regain that relationship with his father in The Little Boy Lost, but actually it would have been wrong for him to have followed his father, and actually it's the positive role of God that reunites the little boy with his mother in a world of innocence. So yeah, I've said here that it's more about the role of a heavenly father to rid children of oppression and control if the boy had followed his own father. The fourth point, ultimately it is the hegemonic forces who offer benevolence. So I've kind of put that as sort of a satirical comment, perhaps by Blake, to children, which leads to their own oppression and control of them. So we see the religious figures in Holy Thursday because in the absence of parents, they have, as I've said here, refashioned the meaning of parental responsibility through religious education, through a very regimented and restricted format. Some more AO3 I can bring in is about my understanding of charity schools and how these were perceived by society, and then actually in practice how they were repressing these children's imagination, individuality and any flair that they had, but also how the childhood innocence can be disrupted through re-education. So they're being thrust into a world of experience and they're not even aware of it, and they're becoming part of the status quo. So my conclusive points, because your conclusion, you want to make it spicy, you want to make it fiery, you want to make it different to what you've just done in the introduction, otherwise what is the point? So I think it's really important to, in a punchy way, still add your flair of writing. Essay writing doesn't have to be confined and dull. It can still have triplets, it can still pose questions, just not too many. My laptop's coming up. So I've said overall,